Welcome, everybody. We are excited to have this event tonight honoring Dr. Collins and learning from him. He has written a book, What's Worth Teaching, Rethinking Curriculum in the Age of Technology. And tonight's event is co-sponsored by the Graduate School of Education and also the TILOS Initiative. I just want to say a little word about TILOS. TILOS is an initiative that is focused on trying to conceptualize ways that we can support equity for learning by using technology to increase learning opportunities. And we work in a few different ways. We fund innovation on the part of graduate students and faculty and their partners. We also try to support collaboration by hosting events like the one tonight, where we can bring people together who work in very different areas. Some people work in industry, some people work in schools. And then we also work to support educators directly. We've had about 12 convenings so far, a lot of different speakers, many unique visitors, and just interested to get a show of hands tonight how we're doing with bringing different people together. How many people in the room consider themselves researchers or academics? Lots of people, okay. How many people consider themselves to be designers or working in industry? Great. How many people consider themselves to be educators in school? Lots of you too. And how about out-of-school educators? A few, great. How many parents do we have in the room? Lots, okay. So one of the things that we've realized by having these open public convenings is that we are bringing together people who don't normally meet. And tonight it's wonderful because we'll have an opportunity to not only have some discussion, but also we have a reception that follows. And so we hope that you all meet somebody new. We have a broad leadership group. So just really quickly, people who work on the TILOS initiative could raise their hands, or who have been funded by the TILOS initiative. Few people, great. Okay, so we've got people doing research here as well. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Dean Schwartz, who's going to introduce Dr. Collins. And then we're going to hear from Dr. Collins on his book, and then we're going to have a little bit of time for Q&A before we hit the reception. Dan.
Thank you, Bridget.
Yes.
Welcome, everybody. This is the GSE half. What, you need your keys by any chance? Other things? So it is my great pleasure to introduce Alan Collins. So he is both the father and godfather of bringing cognitive science into education. So let me talk about the father part first. So some of his, in your career, you hope you have one or two hits, and you play your favorites. Alan has had several. So his first one was he found a way to formalize the representation of how people keep meaning connected in their heads, which spawned a spectacular amount of research supporting this model. And these were called semantic networks. He then went on and made the first intelligent tutoring system, right? And then from there, if you've heard of cognitive apprenticeship, that would be another Collins specialty. Another one is epistemic games. I've never liked that one, but that's okay. It continues. So this is a stunning record. Each of these things, the number of people who followed them and built these ideas out is huge. I'm more interested in talking about the godfather part. So Alan Collins has written a reference letter for every single person who is in the learning sciences or does technology and education, right? He is the person who has decided who are faculty around the world. And this is a very godfather kind of thing. At one point, he told me he was writing a letter on my behalf. And I'm not sure I said anything. He said, maybe you should write it, Dan. That's like the most intimidating thing you have ever done. So my decision with Alan is that given the letters he's written and the number of people he's introduced, and the number of times he's been discussant at a session. So when I die, Dr. Collins is actually going to do the speech on my behalf. This is going to be your most important legacy. But I am very pleased to have you here speaking on probably one of our most significant questions right now, which is what is worth teaching. So thank you for joining us.
Yes, I do weddings and funerals for a small fee, if anyone's interested. So it's a nice thin book with a very high price as far as I'm concerned. I don't blame me for that. But it's a nice weekend read, or in the summer, a nice beach read. So let me go on to the goals of the book. What I'm really trying to do is raise the issue of whether we should replace the Carnegie Commission recommendations for schooling, which have infected our curriculum since the early 20th century. And really, I sort of have a fairly low opinion of the current curriculum, although the topics are wonderful. I'm not claiming I have the answers, but I'm 80 now, and I've reached the age of pontification. So I feel free to tell you all what you should be learning and teaching. So I'm just run through the table of contents a little bit. So the first chapter is my rant on what's wrong with the curriculum. The second chapter is about how kids are living in this media space, texting and presenting themselves on social media and joining fan fiction clubs and all this sort of thing. But that has little impact at all on the teaching of literacy now. And in that chapter, I talk about the kinds of literacy skills that I really think kids should be learning in school. And Sarah Friedman is here, I learned, and so she'll probably disagree with me, but we can deal with that later. Developing self-sufficiency. So we're clearly, I like to say we're moving back to the kind of freelance economy that we had before the Industrial Revolution, when most people were farmers or shopkeepers, etc., but they were all on their own. There was no social safety net, and so they were at the whim of fire and health and financial panics and whatever else the world throws at you. And so to prepare kids that are going out into this world, they really need to learn a lot about how to be self-sufficient, and I don't think school's teaching that. The next chapter is on how the workplaces are losing all their routine jobs, and so unfortunately, to survive in this world, you have to think, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about how to think, how to be strategic. I actually think about writing a book on strategic laziness, how to avoid doing things you shouldn't be doing. The next chapter is on public policy challenges. Our problems are getting worse. I mean, because we've got a highly complex society with a lot of technology, most people don't understand how these complex systems work, and so our problems are harder to solve, like our medical problem and our environmental problems. So I'll talk about that kind of stuff. The next chapter is sort of my radical views about mathematics and science. in the interest of hoping to get time to answer questions at the end, I have been skipping the math and science chapter, but it's sort of saying, well, what people, instead of learning to perform like computers, they need to learn how to mathematize situations, and they need to figure out how to investigate things scientifically. And so that's what's in the chapter. You'll hear a few more remarks about my radical views on science. The last chapter finishes on my dream of a passion school, to sort of argue that we could create schools where kids love to go to school and where they investigate important issues and build interesting projects. So that's the finishing kick on the talk. And since I'm going to rush through it, I enjoy answering questions more than talking, so I'm trying to get through. Anyway, so the Peggy Sue story is one of my favorite stories. There was a movie called Peggy Sue Got Married that Francis Ford Coppola made back in the 80s or 90s. And in it, Peggy Sue goes back to her 25th high school reunion. And she's cast into a time warp, and she finds herself sitting in algebra class. And the algebra teacher is giving a test that day, and the class ends with Peggy Sue's classic remark to her teacher, "Well, Mr. Snellgrove, I happen to know that algebra will never have any use for me in my life, and I speak from experience." Along those same lines, Tony Wagner wrote a book called The Global Achievement Gap, and he reports that they ask MIT graduates what mathematics they use in their lives, figuring that these highly technological people would be maybe using a lot of the math like algebra. Their answer was they use basic arithmetic and they use probability and statistics. And that is pretty much it. I like to say, I've done experiments with scientists, and they tend to know about a lot of different kinds of functions, like exponentials and asymptotic functions and growth functions. So I think that functions are also important, and that's in my math chapter that you won't hear about. The Phil Sadler story is another example of what's wrong with the school curriculum. He's an astronomer at Harvard, and back, I think, in the 90s, he asked 24 graduating seniors at Harvard, a prestige institution on the other side of the country, about what causes the phases of the moon and what causes the seasons. Now, 3 of 24 students, graduating seniors now, knew what causes the phases of the moon. Most people think it's caused by shadows from the Earth, believe it or not. Only 1 knew what causes the seasons. And if you read the book, you can find out what causes those 2 things. Anyway, why don't they know this? This is taught to them probably in middle school, about thereabouts. Well, they never use the knowledge. And our curriculum is full of stuff that people never use. I think it's part of it is because there's all these different interest groups that are pushing for their stuff to get into the curriculum. So that biologists want us to learn about stomata and historians want us to learn about the French revolutions. In the spirit of Seymour Papert, I thought of this book as I wrote it as Seymour Papert's answer to E.D. Hirsch. these are not, I mean, knowing about stomata and knowing about the French Revolution are not things that are they're not powerful ideas. They're not gonna help you navigate through this world you're entering. An even more striking case is in Texas. The school board, I think back in the early 2000s, they were a conservative group, and they thought all the textbooks should cover Phyllis Schlafly and the National Rifle Association. I mean, again, these are things that are not very helpful to making good policy decisions and being good citizens. The Valverde and Schmidt quote I like to point out. They were looked at the third international math and science study, and Americans did very well in the fourth grade, and by the eighth grade they were doing below average. And so they tried to figure out why that was, and what they came up with was the idea that the textbooks, they looked at our textbooks, and they have just a vast number of topics that they cover in them, whereas textbooks in other countries are much more focused on important ideas. And so they decided that that's what's causing the fall off among our kids. And so it's just the same story you may have heard in the quote, our curriculum is a mile wide and an inch deep. And that's a problem. So my general view is that unless schools pursue topics, unless students pursue topics that they care about, they're not going to remember what they learned there. So now my rant about testing. And Seymour got there first, too. I mean, basically, Papert says that it's very easy to test for knowledge, recall of facts and procedures, and so that's what our objective tests pretty much are composed of. But for over 100 years, as we've emphasized testing more and more, we've been narrowing the curriculum so that I list in the book about 15 different things that are really important to learn that we're not testing, and therefore they're not being taught for the most part. There's 5 of them. The other really perverse thing about testing is that it turns students into winners and losers. The beauty of apprenticeship is we don't test people and say you're a loser, or we try to teach to what your capabilities. We're trying to make you be the best person you can be at whatever you do. Most kids don't win at the school game. You all won, I'm sure, or you wouldn't be here. But I'd say only 20% at most are winners in the school competition with testing. Okay, so that's my rant about what's wrong with the school curriculum. The new literacy, as I say, kids, are living in a different media space than we all grew up in, I suspect. I think there are really important things to be learning, and I started writing this book with Barbara White, and she died about 3 or 4 years ago, and I ended up revising it radically. So I'm the sole author, as it were, but I cite her work a lot. One of the things she was doing with 5th graders was they were reading a book called Ishi, of the last of some Indian tribe in California. And the kids were playing managerial roles as they read the book. And she started with a set of cognitive roles, things like the theory manager, the evidence manager, and the synthesizer, synthesizing manager. Anyway, she had these little booklets that the kids had, and they named different kinds of problems and different strategy things they could say in order to get the group to discuss the issue. And those are the kind of things that people should be asking themselves as they think and read. So those were the cognitive strategies, and after they played those for about 6 or 8 weeks, they played a set of social managerial roles. So there was an equity manager and a communication manager, and I forgot all the other two, but so they played those for a while, as well as the cognitive roles they had played earlier. And then they began playing metacognitive roles, and the metacognitive roles were a planning manager, a monitoring manager, a reflection manager, and a revision manager. So these were teaching them to think about what they've decided and how their work is going, etc. So, she found that the kids really remembered the different kinds of things to say, playing the different roles. So they by doing that for at least a whole semester, they really learned to ask these kind of questions as they worked. So I think it's possible to teach how to carry on productive dialogues, and I'm not sure we do much. Then the next thing I go on and on about is how do you be persuasive, and I think particularly as you work in this world where you're trying to get people to do things for you and get them to buy your products, etc. Being persuasive is a really critical kind of skill. So I tend to talk about the strategies you can use to be understandable, the strategies you can use to be convincing, the strategies you can use to be interesting, and the strategies you can use to be memorable. So those are the kinds of things that I think that kids should be learning in the context of all the things they're doing in school. Then finally, on the negotiating effectively issue, so a lot of that discussion is on how you find compromises, find ways of satisfying different people's interests. I've been working with one of Barbara's students, Marcela Borge, at Penn State, and she has been running a design club in an after-school context for like middle school kids. And they keep coming back year after year, and they start out with tasks like designing a garden for a family with a particular set of characteristics. So they have to learn how to pay attention to what the family's needs and constraints are. They have to learn how to plan. They have to learn how to negotiate. They have to learn how to persuade each other. So we have this dream of trying to figure out all the different kinds of things these kids are learning over the years they're in the club. And I have the hope that I can sort of identify like some of the different things that people who are good listeners do. It's like they ask questions, they elaborate on other people's ideas, they look you in the eye. So those are things that I guess Marcella and I have this dream of being able to assess whether people are actually getting better at lots of different things like planning and trying to satisfy constraints, etc. So that's all I'm going to say about literacy. But that's all not being taught, any of that, pretty much. On to self-sufficiency for the gig economy. So I go on and on in the book about the fact that we're teaching the wrong sciences. We're teaching currently biology, chemistry, physics, and earth science, and those are all things that kids can forget the next year. I mean, they never use that knowledge, and so there's unless, of course, they become scientists, then they might in fact use it. And I'm all for people learning things that they really think they want to learn. If they want to learn Chinese history, I'm going to help them as best I can. I mean, that's my job as a teacher. So anyway, but I think that kids should be instead studying health science, because that's a matter of life and death. And David Lodge, who I cite a lot, says, you know, we're living, a lot of us are living miserable lives because of our lifestyle. And that that 70% of most illnesses, I mean, you know, heart disease and cancer, I mean, are largely caused by lifestyle. So so I want kids investigating issues like obesity, addiction, and figuring out, you know, what are the causes? Why do we have an obesity epidemic now? How can the society try to deal with the issue? So these are the kinds of problems we're facing now, and we will be facing into the rest of the century. So so my argument is that let kids try to solve our major problems in the world. I think they need to worry about financial matters and legal matters. I mean, if they're going to be freelancers, they're going to have problems with clients. I mean, they do. I talk a lot about the strategies for developing a growth mindset. I want kids to really be tackling problems and feeling like they're coming up with solutions, and I think that's a good way to begin to think that they're learners. So that's my wave in the terms of Carol Dweck, who I've known for many, many years. And learning self-control. I talk a lot about Baumeister's and Michel's work, and the fact that it looks from all the psychological data that the things that really determine your success in life are your ability to self-regulate, and I guess I think we have to worry a lot about co-regulation. How do we manage to work with each other and and meet deadlines, etc. So that's a biggie for me, and a little wave to Bransford on being more adaptive. Careers. So all the routine jobs, there's lots of literature on how they're disappearing, and that's one of the problems our society has been dealing with. We have a lot of people who feel thrown away by the society. So I like to think that creative thinking and critical thinking are becoming more and more important. Managing time and resources, and I'll refer to that as I go through the talk, and also working with others. Bridget here has done wonderful work on our inability to work with others. So the chapter goes into strategies for how to work more effectively with other people. But let me talk a little bit about creative thinking, just for the fun of it. Many years ago, when I was young and I would go around the research firm where I worked called BBN Technologies and ask people, one of the tasks I gave them was think up ideas for what makes a party, writing an essay on what makes a party interesting. And Deidre Gentner, who's a famous psychologist now, who works on analogy a lot, was one of my subjects, and she did a very interesting thing from my point of view. She first of all did a case comparison study. So she thought of 4 particular parties she had been to, and one of which was really terrible, where the people all sat in a circle, and she really struggled to keep a conversation going. So that impressed her as not the way to run a party. So she then came up with this theory. She had 2 critical elements to a good party. One was the notion of she called cover, which what she meant is little niches where groups could gather and have private conversations. And the other was disruptive activities, which relates to some of Jeff Hinton's work of like dancing and food and drinks. So you can break off conversations when they get kind of boring and go do something, find another group. So those were her 2 critical variables. And then she came up with an analogy to a chemical soup, which was the notion that the things move around and then they precipitate out. So the groups that are really working, people keep talking because they're having such an interesting time. So that was her model of a good party was a what's called an agent model in the AI literature, or a process model of a certain type. Another subject was an old AI person called Oliver Selfridge, who had actually written children's books, and he approached the problem entirely different from Deidre. What he tried to do was come up with the set of primitive elements that make a good party. It's sort of like the chemical elements or the elements that make up the atom. That's what his target structure was, different than an agent model. But his strategy for thinking about the issue was what's called perspective shifting. And there's this book by Richard Young, Becker, and Kenneth Pike called Rhetoric, Discovery, and Change. And they describe how you do perspective shifting, which pretty well described the way Oliver approached the problem. So they suggest that you look at something as a thing in itself and its subparts and how they fit together. That's one perspective. A second perspective is how the thing has changed over time. And a third perspective is how the thing lives in its greater context. So they suggest that that's a way to think creatively about issues. So that's what Oliver did, and he came up with his set of 3 or 4 elements that he thought were critical to an interesting party. So basically, my take on creative thinking is having these kinds of strategies like case comparison and making analogies that are effective for thinking of things in new ways, perspective taking. I think that's all I want to say about oh no, I'm going to talk about critical thinking too. I like to cite some of Barbara White's work on reflection. And so as part of critical thinking, although the chapter talks about other aspects of critical thinking, how to generate questions, for example. So Fredrickson with John, Barbara White with John Fredrickson did a study where they had kids trying to do science projects with Thinker tools, which was a kind of physics playground that she and Paul Horowitz had developed. And they had 3 teachers in the Bay Area, and each of those 3 teachers taught two science classes slightly differently. One class, they did this kind of reflection with these set of criteria, and in the other class, they spent the same amount of time just discussing what they had done, basically. And so she had the students who were working in groups to evaluate their work with these 9 or 8 criteria, and justify their evaluations. Now, and you see these sort of cover a lot of different aspects, process and product and other aspects of things. So they sort of cover the waterfront in a certain way. So, and what she found was that the students that did the reflections learned a lot more than the ones that didn't do the reflections. And furthermore, it was the weaker students that improved the most. So that's one way to think about critical thinking that I think is helpful. Okay, on to chapter 5, which is my chapter on public policy challenges, sort of being a good citizen. One of my problems is a lot of our discourse on like economic matters and environmental matters don't seem very intelligent. And I think that's a failure of education broadly. And this gets me, and Val Schutz said I should emphasize understanding complex systems. So I talk a lot about leverage points and positive and negative feedback loops and incentives in the book. The kinds of issues that I want kids. So my 3 sciences to replace the old 4 are health science, as I said, environmental science, and economics. Although I do have to point out that there's a lot of psychology woven into the earlier chapters, but that's woven in and not as a thing in and of itself. So basically, I would like to see kids really trying to solve our big environmental issues. So one of the big issues is we've got population growth that we're around 7.2 or 3 billion now, and we're headed for 11 billion by the end of the century, where hopefully things will top out about there. But we have all these agricultural practices that are kind of marginal, like growth hormones and whether we're going to run out of soil and water. And the GMO issue. So I want kids to begin to address the issue of how are we going to feed 11 billion people, and what should we do? What should we be doing in order to feed those people, or somehow do we want to start regulating population like the Chinese tried to do at one point? The other issue, the next issue, I like to cite a famous bet between Paul Ehrlich here at Stanford, who was sort of worried about running out of all sorts of resources, and Julian Simon, an economist, who said, well, the prices of resources have been falling in general over the last 100 years. So Simon offered a bet to Ehrlich in the 1990s. What he said was, you pick a set of resources you think we're using up, and you pick a time span, and I'll make you a bet that the prices of those resources goes down, and you should bet that it'll go up. And so Ehrlich picked 5 different minerals and a 10-year time period, and he lost on all 5 bets. Now that's not the last word. In fact, some of those things have since gone up in price from where they were at the time of the bet. And I do think that there are things we are running out of. I mean, I think we're close to having water wars in various parts of the world, fresh water, and soil erosion is a problem that we're not dealing. Now, Simon will say, well, if we don't have any soil, we'll just grow things hydroponically, and he might be right. Basically, Simon's argument is there's enough substitution that goes on that's why resources don't get used up. And we'll stop using oil at some time, so its price will go down. But kids should be studying these issues. I mean, they're subtle issues that are complex, and they need to think about it. Pollution. China and India are knee-deep in pollution now in their cities, and it's probably killing a lot of their population. Back in England in 1948, there was in London, there was a London fog that turned into a London smog that killed thousands of people. And they started, and that's in some sense because the British were using coal to heat their houses. My wife, who's British, remembered somebody walking with a lantern to guide the bus along the route during that time. But London doesn't have smog anymore, and the Thames has fish in it. They cleaned that up. They couldn't live there back in those days. So developed countries clearly are figuring out ways to control pollution. We've got a new pollution now with carbon and methane gas in our atmosphere. So how do countries deal with pollution, and are they? I mean, can we deal with the carbon pollution problem? Species extinction, again, a big issue. E.O. Wilson says half of all the species will be gone in the next 100 years. We've been obviously killing off a lot of species ever since we landed here. So the question here is, does it matter? I mean, that's an important question. What can we do about it? We also have a big problem with species invasion, and like I think they're cobras in Florida. I've forgotten exactly what. Oh, pythons in Florida. So what should we be doing about those kinds of issues? And then finally, climate change clearly is a big issue. I like to tell the story of, well, first of all, the one thing I'm grateful to climate change for is that we would have been heading into another ice age by now, except for our carbon pollution. So Boston is safe from ice now because of the carbon pollution. But the problem is that over the millennia, when we've had very high carbon levels, which we are getting to now, the sea levels have risen over 200 feet higher. So there goes Bangladesh, and there goes Florida, and there goes all the major cities along the coast. So we should begin to think about how to deal with that issue. Well, we are beginning to. I mean, but I don't think our discussions are very intelligent. I also think that that our public policy understanding of economic issues is not very good. First of all, the money supply fluctuates because banks loan out money, and that creates money. But what happened in the Great Depression of the 30s, as Milton Friedman found, that the money supply shrunk by 27%, which was enough to send us from 29 to a depression that lasted until World War II. We almost got another one back when there was a housing bubble in the early 2000s in America, and Robert Shiller had pointed it out at the time, but it burst, and that's what caused the Great Recession, as it's called, in 2007 and 8. But we were saved by the inches from another Great Depression. So you can all thank Ben Bernanke for for keeping Hank Paulson from shutting down any more places like Lehman Brothers. So we need, people need to understand these issues in a much, because we're going to be faced with these problems forever. But we need, the kids should be investigating how to deal with. One thing we should be thinking deeply about is how do you stop bubbles from growing? How do you prevent housing bubbles in the future or whatever? I think the understanding of government debt is pretty primitive. Most people sort of think of government debt as like personal debt, but it's not really like personal debt, and so they need to understand the differences. Sumner Slichter from Harvard wrote about how, in fact, the fact that we have all these treasury bonds has tended to reduce the fluctuation in the money supply. So government debt has some positive benefits, but Greece is in real danger, and Japan has a much huger debt level than America, but it's not in real danger. And why? And understanding that is important. Markets. And kids need to understand supply and demand. I ran an experiment once with my colleagues at BBN on why wages hadn't risen from the 1970s to the 1990s in America. And they haven't risen since either. And all of the scientists used supply and demand in order to figure it out. But what people need to understand about markets is they're very good at some things, as Adam Smith wrote in 1776. There's this invisible hand that means when there's a shortage of something, the price goes up and more people produce it. But that gets you into trouble with fishing, for instance. Tuna gets more expensive, more and more boats go out to catch tuna, and pretty soon we won't have any tuna left. So the trouble with markets is they don't acknowledge the cost to the environment, so GE can dump a lot of pollution into the Hudson River, and it doesn't cost them anything to do it. But there's other kinds of costs that markets don't consider, like the costs of closing a factory in a town, which leads to lots of unemployment, so we pay unemployment insurance to them, which the market doesn't care about. And also the town may get depressed and become a ghost town ultimately. There's a nice book about how Wall Street investors killed the Anchor Hocking Glass Company in Chillicothe, Ohio, and it literally destroyed that town. So markets are problematic, and people need to understand why and how. Incentives. There was an economist who liked to start his course in economics with the story about how the British used to send their prisoners to Australia. And the problem they had was that a lot of prisoners were dying on the trip to Australia, which led to a huge backlash among the population of Britain. And so they tried all sorts of things to prevent that from happening. For instance, they put doctors on board every ship with prisoners to try to prevent the prisoners from dying. But that didn't work. And nothing worked until an economist came along and said, well, you should pay the ship captains on the basis of the number of healthy prisoners they deliver rather than the number of healthy prisoners they send. And that fixed the problem. But a lot of the solutions to we have a healthcare cost crisis because we pay hospitals and doctors on the basis on the number of procedures they carry out. So every hospital has to get an MRI machine, and they have to run as many tests as they can in order to pay for that MRI machine. So if we keep paying people for doing things, they're going to do more things and not worry particularly about the health of the people. So understanding incentives is critical. Globalization is critical. I like to say that globalization is, there's nice data from Saxenian about how most of the firms in Silicon Valley are started by immigrants as founders, have one or more immigrants as a founder. A lot of the wealth of America comes from its immigrants, but clearly people get upset if there's a lot of immigrants. So what do you do? I mean, how do you balance these? And kids need to think about the issue there. I mean, I think it brought us Brexit, and I think it also might have brought us Donald Trump. So globalization is a central issue, and then I like to go on and on about what are all the different things that affect the growth rate of countries, and how can we help poor countries in, say, Africa, etc., to begin to develop healthy economies that support people better. So those are my dreams about science education, kids really investigating important issues. Now on to my dreams. I talk in this chapter a little bit about this community of learners school that Barbara Rogoff sent her kids to in Colorado when they were young. It was an elementary school, and the kids, there was sort of a negotiation that went on between the teachers who know what kids really need to learn and the students who had their interests and desires. And so it was a negotiation process of getting kids to interact and work together to build, to investigate things, to build things. And there were no grades in the school. There was just, the teachers would write reports about what the kids were doing. The kids loved it. They loved to go to school. But the data on high schools in America, you can go, people have done tests where they ask high school students what they think of school, and they think it's a prison. And they think it's a prison because they're being forced to do all this stuff that they don't want to do. So if you're forced to do stuff you don't want to do, it's not very surprising that you don't remember it later. You try and repress it probably. Then another school, I worked with Deborah Meyer when she was at Central Park East Secondary School back in the 90s. And there were two things I loved about this school. One is their 5 habits of mind. I refer to habits of mind as dispositions, like a good psychologist. But so the 5 there are the kinds of things that kids were supposed to be asking themselves all the time in everything they did in the school. When I gave a talk at Rutgers recently, one of my former students pointed out that at the end of talks, it was question number 5 that I would always ask the speaker. So I'm fair game. Let me go on. So this, by the way, got picked up by the high-tech schools down in San Diego, those 5 criteria. The other thing I really loved about Central Park East was the Senior Institute, which was the last 2 years. What kids were mainly doing in those last 2 years was putting together a portfolio of 14 different areas. And this list gives you sort of a sense of what those 14 areas were. The one thing I like about it is that it really addresses the narrowing of the curriculum problem. In other words, so it's broad, and it's really relevant to things kids do in life. The second thing I like about it was that you sort of had a thesis committee for each one of these things. So you had an advisor, and some of your committee would be other faculty. There were students on most of the committees, and maybe community members. So, and then you had an oral defense often and that sort of proves that you've actually done the work and not had somebody else do it for you. And kids could take more than 2 years if they needed it to finish their graduation portfolio. So that's my one of my dreams about assessment. Okay, so now let me just talk briefly about the design of Passion schools. I use the term passion schools, but I don't think that most kids have passions. Although Seymour Papert liked to tell the story of his grandson when he was 3 years old. He was a dinosaur nut, and his parents had bought him all these videos of dinosaurs, and Seymour's tagline was, "Before he could read or write, he knew much more about dinosaurs than I'll ever know." And that's what technology is doing to us, guys. Anyway, so I'm sorry, I got the wrong slide. The Passion School elements, those are some of the kinds of things that I think are neat ways to engage kids. So, but let me go on to beginning curricula. So when kids come in when they turn 6 years old, let's say, we'll send them off to a Passion school, and they'll do maybe one curricula in the morning and one curricula in the afternoon. And these are some possible topics that you might have that kids could engage in. Now, they don't have to be passionate about any of them, but they need to have preferences, and we need to put them into curricula that, and the idea of the curricula is this kind of Deweyan notion that you sort of use each of these curricula to get at issues in history and mathematics and science and geography and whatever else that we think are important to learn. So that's some possible curricula. Let me give you some possible dinosaur activities if you're Seymour Papard's grandson. So you might work, so groups of kids might work on a timeline of different dinosaurs lived, why they disappeared, designing a school, a dinosaur zoo, and how it would run, comparing meat eating, that's a systematic comparison, case comparison of plant eating and meat eating dinosaurs. Map of dinosaur skeletons, where they found, that gets you into geography. Investigating how birds descended from dinosaurs, that gets you into evolution. That specify environments where different dinosaurs lived. So that's, again, a kind of geography kind of issue. I remember interviewing one of the kids in Ann Brown and Joe Campione's Fostering a Community of Learners schools in Berkeley, I think. And this one kid was but from Jurassic Park, he got really interested in the whole DNA issue and whether we could resurrect dinosaurs. And that we're getting close to being able to do these things. So those are the kind of things that kids might like to investigate. As they get older, I see the curricula becoming more career-oriented, sort of like in Oakland, California. A lot of the schools, there's a biomedical school and a legal school and I don't know, all sorts of. New York has Bronx High School of Science and the Performing Arts School. So basically, those are the notions. I have a kind of a model of cognitive apprenticeship for such a school, where students come in as novices and they work on their own project with one of the more experienced kids helping them. And the teacher has to mentor that kid in how to be a good mentor to the new kid. Okay. As they gain experience, they'll work on projects with other kids, investigating different issues or building different things. After they've worked with on a number of different projects, then they would start to do their mentoring of a new student, and when they've gotten their mentoring skills a little bit up to par, then they might be able to be sub-project directors or project directors on bigger projects. In assessment, I think that we should have digital portfolios for all the work that the kids are doing in school. A lot of it would be offline work, but it could be documented. The Digital Youth Network had a remix world where kids were producing products of various kinds, and Bridget wrote a book about that with Nicole and Kim, which I love. So there they were putting together their works and getting critiques. The badges movement, and I think the Digital Youth Network also got into badges, but Diana Joseph there, who was my student at Northwestern, set up a kind of video making curriculum for like middle school kids, and she had different kinds of badges or certifications. I think one for budgeting and one for script writing, and maybe there might have been other skills that they do. So this is a way to kind of try to evaluate like the merit badge idea in scouting, to evaluate what kinds of capabilities or competencies the kids are getting, rather than measuring just whether they could sit in a school for 12 years and get a degree. And then finally, I love the graduation exams at Central Park East, so that's the way I would finish off the schooling experience. So, in conclusion, I think it's possible to create schools that children will love to go to. I think we can't do grades and tests in them. I want them to be working on meaningful, and when I say meaningful issues and projects, I mean things that they find meaningful. Now, interests develop. I mean, and when you get involved in doing stuff and working on it, you get interested in it very often. And so you don't have to come in with a passion, but you ought to be doing things that you think are meaningful. I think students need to work together to meet deadlines. If they're going to learn how to manage time and resources, they've got to they've got to practice it. They can't just get a college degree and go off and learn it later. Different curricula engage students in all the kinds of topics I've been talking about and the stuff I didn't talk about. And then finally, a focus on sense-making and producing products rather than learning facts and procedures. So that's my take on what's wrong with the curriculum. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Alan. So we have only a couple of minutes for questions, in part because we have this beautiful reception that will expire at 7:30, but we want to give the audience an opportunity to ask a couple of questions here, and then, like any great party, we will break out and have some disruptive activity and be able to corner Alan and also get to buy his book and have him sign it. Right here up in the front.
Are there any subjects that you think students should study that are not useful? The subject itself is not really useful in their life, but the subject is the most efficient way of learning a particular thinking skill?
So basically, I don't think we learn thinking skills by, like, solving algebra problems. In other words, the answer is basically, if you want to learn Chinese history, I want to give you the support I can to learn, even though that may be no use to you. It may turn out to be a lot of use to you. Okay. So if you have some passion, if you want to learn how to speak Portuguese, I want to give you the resources and the help you need. I mean, it's the answer is, I don't believe in requirements, and I don't believe in, but I do believe in supporting people who have interests. And so that, and in fact, I have, as a teacher, I have supported people doing theses on topics I knew very little about. Yes.
So your desire to create a curricula in which there are no tests explicitly or grades, we're sitting in an institution which requires excellent test-taking scores and superb grades. Do we start changing this from the bottom in an elementary school, preschool, kindergarten? Or does it have to come from a school like Stanford?
Yeah, it would help if Stanford would give up its emphasis on test taking. I think colleges. I'm sorry. I think colleges are pretty good at letting in homeschool kids. Now they may do it on the basis of SAT scores or something. I'm not sure, but but I think that colleges can make perfectly good decisions without all this test taking. I mean, and it would. I think some colleges have tried to do that. They were probably in the East rather than the West. But yes, back there.
I'm curious to hear how you envision. Hi, I'm curious to hear how you envision teacher preparation programs and policies related to teacher preparation and education would change alongside like these curriculum changes.
Okay. Basically, so I want teachers to be good mentors. And I spend a lot of time mentoring. And what mentors have to do is to try to find out where your interests lie, what ideas you have that might be of value and worth pursuing. So that's a very different kind of teacher education. I think it's one of the things about homeschooling is that parents don't think they know everything, and so they're not telling kids what to think or what they should learn. They're trying to encourage them often to help to pursue things they're interested in, and I think so. Good mentors, know to send you to people that have the kinds of expertise you need, or the books, or whatever. So a lot of what mentorship involves is helping you find the knowledge you're seeking.
One last question.
Well,
You were talking about portfolios for children's projects at one point, and I was thinking, are you thinking about these as being individual portfolios for the child's personal growth, or more of a shared database of projects?
I assume projects will be both joint and individual. So in remake, the kinds of things that are going on in the Digital Youth Network, a lot of them are personal, kids building, writing blogs or making music videos or what have you. So with mentorship from artists in the community. Basically, but kids need to learn to work with others, and so they need to be doing joint projects. And it would be nice for kind of an evaluation of the contributions of the different people to each portfolio.
Great. I know we had one more question right here that
Sure.
we could end with, and then we're going to go to the reception.
I was curious how you envision the role of the parent in this curriculum, because I know they play an important role in our current school system, and how could they contribute and support your passion school that you envision?
Okay, so what's the role of parents in this vision? I don't write about it at all, I confess, but basically what I would hope, well, I do write about it in this sense that parents are in the negotiations about what curricula the kids engage in, and whether they should change from one. In other words, say you've been doing dinosaurs for half a year, should you move on to families? So parents should be involved in those decisions too. So, and they should be resources to the kids. So the kids are investigating things. They should be talking to grandparents and whoever. So parents are resources. They're guides. They're mentors.
Great. With that, please join me in welcoming.